What life was like in medieval castles. There are a lot of misconceptions about what life was really like in medieval castles. It is commonly believed that medieval people were stupid and superstitious. Knights spent their time gallivanting around the countryside in shining armor, jousting with each other like hockey players on horses. Princesses were locked away in towers until handsome princes showed up to rescue them. Well, none of this is true. So in today's video, we're going to find out what life was really like in medieval castles. From the grandeur of the architecture to the everyday struggles of those who lived there, I'll give you a full picture of what life was really like in these fascinating places. So watch the video till the end and don't forget to like and subscribe. Medieval castles were built as protection from enemies. In order to understand what life in a medieval castle was like, you need to know why they were built. A lot of people think that castles were built solely for the purpose of protection, which is true, but there was more to it than that. They were usually made of wood, but sometimes stone and mortar too. Let's start with the most common building material, wood. Wood was easy and inexpensive to use, so most castles were made from it. However, the stone is a much more durable material and can withstand fire better than wood. Stone is also much harder to cut through, making it harder to break into if you're trying to attack the castle or break out of one that's been taken over by invaders. Because of these benefits, some castles have stone walls as well as wooden ones, or even just stone alone without any wood at all. Not every medieval castle has been excavated. Not every castle from the Middle Ages has been excavated. There are a few reasons for that. Some castles have been lost to history, destroyed by war or natural disasters, or remodeled so much that they're no longer recognizable as castles. Some castles were deliberately constructed to be hidden from view, so archaeologists don't know where to look for them, and you can't just go digging in people's backyards. Some castles have been converted into other uses, like churches or palaces, so they aren't useful anymore as fortresses and dwelling places, although they may still have some architectural value. We know much more about English castles now than we used to. In the past, there was a lot of uncertainty about the lives of people who lived in these castles, how they were built, what they looked like, and where their inhabitants came from. But now we have a lot more information thanks to archaeological excavations and other archaeological research. Today, over 100 castles have been excavated, and researchers are constantly uncovering new sites that can tell us even more about life in medieval times. If you have ever visited an old English castle, you may have wondered who lived there before or after it became a ruin. Were they kings, queens, knights? The truth is, most likely yes. Many people lived in castles throughout history, and not just kings and queens, but also squires, people who owned land, knights, those who fought for their country, servants who worked for these important people, and even prisoners. These days, we don't often think about how many different jobs were needed just to keep things running smoothly at home. But back then, it was pretty common knowledge that keeping everything running smoothly required lots of help from everyone around them. Both paid staff as well as volunteers willing to pitch in when extra hands were needed during busy seasons, like harvest time, or when repairs had become necessary due to damage caused by natural disasters, such as floods caused by heavy rains falling on top during monsoons. People used the spaces in castles very differently from the way we'd use them today. If you're planning a medieval castle vacation and thinking of booking a room at one of these amazing castles, keep in mind that people used the spaces in castles very differently from the way we'd use them today. When you're wandering around a castle and trying to imagine what life was like for its inhabitants, as you can probably imagine, the Great Hall was the largest room in a medieval castle where everyone ate, slept, and relaxed. But there were other rooms that people used too. For example, if you've ever seen photos of castles with spiral staircases leading up to turrets or towers on top of them, well, those were called garderobes. Garderobes were for doing all your business, and I mean that literally. That's because toilets didn't exist back then, so if you needed to go to the bathroom, you'd just do it wherever. Most people in a castle slept on the floor and not in beds. The most common reason for sleeping on the floor was simply that there were too many people in a castle for all of them to have beds. If you're wondering how many people lived in one castle, keep in mind that castles could vary widely depending on their size and layout. Some had hundreds of rooms, while others might have been smaller and more compact. In addition, some castles had more than one level, a ground floor, and an upper story. The number of residents also varied depending on who they were: nobles or peasants, men or women, soldiers or servants. Those who slept on straw mattresses were usually not noblemen, who would often have their own personal space where they could sleep comfortably off the floor, but still not in a bed. The kitchen was one of the most important rooms in a castle. It was usually the largest room, and it was where the servants worked. The lord ate his meals there too, as did his family members if they lived in the castle with him. Food was an important status symbol in medieval life. The higher you rank, the better you ate. A knight was served the meat with his wine at a feast, while peasants only got bread and water. A lord's table would be laden with all kinds of lavish dishes, such as peacock pastries and saffron cakes, while lower-ranking people had to settle for simpler fare, like lamb with peas or roast pork belly. Food was so important that it could even be used as a weapon. When King Richard II of England invited his enemy Henry Bolingbroke to dine with him at York Castle in 1398, he secretly poisoned all the food except for the bread, and then sent them back up to Bolingbroke's room with instructions on exactly how much poison each one contained. There was no such thing as breakfast or lunch for most people living in a castle. Breakfast and lunch were not a concept in the Middle Ages. The food available in most castles was the same all day, whether you were at home or on the road. For example, if you wanted to eat some bread and cheese for breakfast, you would go downstairs to get it from a kitchen that would be open all day long. If it was nighttime and you were hungry for a snack before bedtime, then maybe you'd walk down to your room and make yourself some porridge or slice up some meat with some onions on top. The same goes for dinner too. There was no such thing as lunch because people ate whenever they wanted around meal times, which weren't set times. Food for people living in castles is often spoiled quickly. To prevent this, food was preserved by smoking, salting, pickling, and drying. Food that could not be preserved was stored in a larder or pantry to keep it fresh for as long as possible. It was also stored in a storeroom and kitchen before being taken to the dining hall, where it was cooked on a spit over an open fire. The remains were then stored in a cellar so they could be eaten during the winter months when the game would not be available outside of the castle walls. For entertainment, medieval people liked to play games, go on picnics, and listen to music. A medieval castle was a place where people gathered to eat, sleep, and play. Many castles had a great hall, the largest room in the building, that served as a gathering place for everyone who lived there. Inside the Great Hall were tables for eating, chairs for sitting, and other furniture for working or playing games. There were many different ways to entertain yourself during your time at home, including games like chess, checkers, and backgammon. You could also listen to music played on instruments such as viols, stringed instruments, lutes, plucked stringed instruments, and flutes. You might go on picnics outside your house with friends or family. Picnics were a rare treat because the meat was hard to find, so you would enjoy any chance you got at having one of these special meals. There were lots of types of weapons in medieval times. The most common was the sword and lance. There were also bows and arrows, crossbows, javelins, and other things like catapults. Armor was often made out of leather or metal plates, but could be made from other materials too, such as horn or wood. Life in a medieval castle was not all fun and games. The conditions of living were harsh, with people often living in cramped quarters and having little food to eat. There was also no air conditioning or heating, which meant that people had to deal with the cold weather in their homes. Castles were generally made for defense purposes, meaning that they were built on top of hills or mountains so enemies couldn't easily spot them from afar. This meant that even walking up to your home would be strenuous because you needed strong legs. Lastly, because castles were built on high ground, it was easy for attackers to spot them as well, and these buildings couldn't be easily moved. So if there was an attack by an outside force, such as another army, then everyone inside would either have to fight or flee, which could lead to injury or death. There are many ways to discover what life was really like during this period: reading books by experts on the topic, watching documentaries about it, going through historical archives where documents from those times have been preserved for us today, or even going back yourself if possible and experiencing it firsthand. If you've ever visited a medieval castle, then you know what hard work it must have been to live in one. From the lack of comfort to the constant threat of invasion by enemies, not to mention the smell. It's clear that being a knight or lady wasn't just about dressing up in fancy clothes and riding horses around all day, although we hear there was plenty of that too. But while life may have been uncomfortable at times, it was also exciting and filled with adventure. Hey there, thanks for taking the time to watch our video on medieval castles. We're glad you enjoyed it and hope you learned something new about how people used to live. If you liked what you saw, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and share the video with your friends. We really appreciate your support and can't wait to show you more great content in the future. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon!